Radio addiction starts now.
Power to the people!
The Laura Ingraham Show.
South Korean villages awoke to a world suddenly filled with noise and plague. The communists, made bold by months of small-scale raiding across the 38th parallel, had finally launched their undeclared, all-out war of conquest. Half a world away in Washington, President Truman took immediate action.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. Free nations must be on their guard, more than ever before, against this kind of sneak attack. We are united in detesting communist slavery. We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
We are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost. President Truman, and of course, June 25th, 1950, his announcement that America was all in after the UN decided, of course, it could not tolerate the fact that 135,000 soldiers from communist North Korea crossed the 38th parallel into the South, and that was the beginning of a horrific 3-year military engagement for U.S. forces. In the Korean War's 65th anniversary, the beginning of it, we mark today in an attempt to learn from history, revisit history, some parts of history that have been forgotten. They call this the Forgotten War, but we never forget it here. Chuck Carlson, who's like my second dad, he was a Navy pilot in the Korean War, and my father was in World War II, but just talking to Chuck about what happened there, and it made me mad that, frankly, American students know so little about the Korean War. They don't really know much about the Battle of Pusan or the Battle of Incheon. And some people say the Battle of Incheon could represent the single most courageous military feat ever in the history of warfare. Now, that's saying something. We have a number of voices we're going to hear from this hour on the Laura Ingraham Show. Victor Davis Hanson, of course, who wrote one of the preeminent books on the Korean War, and also Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who is a Korea expert. He'll join us. And now, my great privilege to be joined by Colonel Bill DeGraff, who is a Korean War veteran, West Point class of 1950, and he graduated first in his class. And shortly after graduation, of course, he was shipped out. And then his military career really began. And he joins us now. Colonel DeGraff, it is my great privilege to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us on this momentous day.
Oh, I'm more than glad to do it on this great anniversary.
Sir, what do you think is the biggest misconception that remains out there about the Korean War?
Well, most people, as you say, it's the forgotten war, but they have to realize it was a turning point, in my view, in the military. We suddenly realized that we had to be prepared at all times to answer whatever threats come about. We weren't really prepared for the Korean invasion, and we had to sort of put the finger in the dike. We must never be in a position where we have to do that again.
The Korean War, I will agree, is a turning point for, I think, our post-war military diplomatic strategy. It was the first time the United States went to war to halt communist military expansion. And I think it was the turning point away from what many wanted to be a disarmament period and military weakness to a period of strength. And after Korea, I think our strength was absolutely paramount. Our military strength was paramount in keeping the rest of the, obviously our country safe, but preventing the future spread of communism. And that was the first stand we took. That's
right. And it was a very important part, and of course it played a big role in what we were going to do in Europe.
Now, today, think about it. The Berlin Wall came down. The nations of Eastern Europe now are part of the EU, joined NATO. And so I would say that the forgotten war is forgotten in its absolute importance in setting up the fall of the Soviet Union, ultimately. Because without that stand that we took there, I think all bets are off as to what would have happened with Chinese expansion, even greater so than we see today, but Chinese military expansion, the Russian military expansion. America demonstrated that she would not just sit back and do nothing.
That's correct. A very important aspect of the war was that the message it sent to the world.
Tell us about your experience in battle, because it's easy for someone like me to speak about the war, but actually being the person who does the heavy lifting in battle, that's a completely different matter. I mean, I spent the last 3 or 4 hours before the show began just reading various accounts of the Battle of Pusan, and of course the Battle of Inchon. And it's just, devastating accounts of bravery.
Well, of course, bravery is very individual. It's where a person happens to be at the time. Most men who go into combat are brave just being there. Those men that get Silver Stars and Legions of Medal of Honor and so forth happen to be an extraordinary person at an extraordinary time. It's the day-to-day operation in the field against the enemy, moving forward or resisting his moving forward, that the average GI does as part of his duty, and it doesn't get the recognition that the big battle or the big heroic stand is. It's that individual working within his team to do what needs to be done on the battlefield.
General MacArthur, of course, was stripped of his command in 1951, having a very unfortunate and public dispute with his commander-in-chief, of course, President Truman. And he said this. We'll play the 10th cut, James. This was part of his farewell address in 1951.
There are some who, for varying reasons, would appease Red China. They are blind to history's clear lesson. For history teaches with unmistakable emphasis that appeasement but begets new and bloodier war.
Looking back on MacArthur's words there, obviously he thought that we had an opportunity to stop the Chinese influence, and at the time it was the Russo-Sino alliance. Looking back, was there any thoughts about what he said there? Was he vindicated? I'm going to ask every guest that question.
Well, of course, my view against General MacArthur's, but I happen to disagree with him. I don't see we wanted to be in a head-to-head war with China and its millions of men in their army on mainland China. We would have to be in a nuclear war, and it would have been devastating. He wanted to go to war with China, and Truman firmly believed he should not go to war with China. Truman's the commander-in-chief. Right.
I mean, look, I'm the one who says we shouldn't be going back into the Middle East. I mean, I'm not a neoconservative, I guess. I think we should preserve our military strength, but it is interesting to see the introduction, of course, of Mao and China's advance and China's ultimate position in the world today, all these years later. the country had no appetite to stay in the war. I mean, we can look back on it and say, yeah, we might have done this differently, but the country had no appetite to continue. And that's one of the reasons Dwight Eisenhower, went out of office as one of our most popular presidents, because the nation was out of war, and a lot of people credited him with that.
Well, that's right. And the Korean War, to prolong the Korean War would have just cost a lot of lives and a lot of money for nothing. Unless we were willing to put an all-out charge back up the peninsula, there was just a stalemate. And Eisenhower managed to solve the stalemate problem. Of course, the war is technically still going on. We just have an armistice there.
The one thing that I believe that thing that MacArthur said about what the Korean people did. Obviously, he loved his men, and there are a lot of issues with MacArthur. Right, a lot of personally, people don't. People say he's this or that. I'm trying to put the personality aside, but he loved his men, and he believed that the Korean people didn't get the credit that they deserved for standing up against the communist influx, as devastating as it was. They chose to actually fight, and I think it's important to remember that, because the casualties were horrific. There were 1 million civilian casualties, 217,000 in South Korea. North Korea had slightly fewer, but this is a bloody, bloody war. And America had 54,326 die, and I think we have 7,800. Is that right, Colonel? Missing in action to this day.
Something like that. Yes. I
mean, just that figure is staggering. What's the one memory you take forward of the war, the most difficult and the most, if you would share them with us, and the most heartening?
Well, actually, they sort of blend together. The most difficult part was to see South Korea, and for that matter, North Korea, torn apart, villages destroyed, civilians homeless or dead. They lived a very hard scrabble life in those days. Their main way of getting around was ox cart drawn carts, or what they called A-frames that they car on their backs. And these people were very hard-working people, and they were very subsistence level. But they fought back. They established their country, and their country today is one of the leading manufacturing countries in the world. I watched the change in it from the 1950 to 1990, the last time I was there, 1992. They have done a fantastic job.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, Colonel, we really appreciate your time. Colonel William DeGraff, West Point, class of 1950, and proud veteran of the Korean War. Thank you very much, sir. When we come back, we're going to talk to Victor Davis Hanson, the author of The Savior Generals, How 5 Great Commanders Saved the Wars That Were Lost. And we'll give you the update on the Supreme Court's upholding the Obamacare subsidies by a vote of 6-3.
The Laura Ingraham Show.
Of the nations of the world, Korea alone, up to now, is the sole one which has risked its all against communism. The magnificence of the courage and fortitude of the Korean people defies description.
That's General MacArthur, his farewell address in April of 1951, and giving his take on where the war was in Korea at the time. And today is the 65th anniversary of the start of the Korean War, and I was so looking forward to doing this hour on radio because I knew I'd be joined by Victor Davis Hanson, who is one of the preeminent experts, I think, in his writing. Is just there's few people that I just run to read, and he's one of them. Of course, we have him on a number of issues, whether it's immigration or any of the inanity to erase history from our consciousness. But this is a special one, and we're delighted he's with us. Victor Davis Hanson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And your book, The Forgotten Maverick General Who Saved South Korea, the book about Matthew Ridgway. We talked about it on the last anniversary, the big anniversary, I think 5 years ago for the 60th. But it's still a war, I think, that is largely misunderstood, Victor. And your perspective on it today, given all that we're facing in the world with the threat from China and all that we're facing in the way of challenges to our military and our national unity.
Well, it's amazing that we did as well as we did, because we got to remember that the Soviets in September 49 had let off a nuclear weapon, and people in the Pentagon had argued that our whole defense posture was based on nuclear exclusivity, that only we had the bomb, and therefore you'd never need a conventional war again. So we had dismantled most of the World War II inventory, and Dean Acheson had given a lecture at the press conference right before the war broke out, saying that Korea really wouldn't and couldn't be in the defense orbit of the United States. And then we had this other problem that we had to rehabilitate Japan, which had had a fascist, terrible record since 1910 in Korea, whereas the communists had taken over in China. They now had the bomb, and then they were posing as liberators from post-colonial Japanese warlords. So everything was sort of a perfect storm against us. And when they invaded in June, they almost went to Pusan. And how we recovered, that was mostly because of Inchon and MacArthur's genius, and then how we recovered from his error of going up all the way to Yalu was pretty amazing. And I think Matthew Ridgway deserves most of the credit for saving South Korea.
In the Battle of Inchon, I think it was one of the most extraordinary feats in military history. Your take on that?
Oh, I agree. Got to remember that the entire Joint Chiefs were against it. The Truman administration didn't know much about it. The tides were very tricky. The United States hadn't really conducted an amphibious operation for 5 years. MacArthur was an older man, 70s, so the idea that you were going to land 350 miles behind Korean lines and then you were going to cut off the entire North Korean army, so to speak, it was pretty risky. And it not only worked, they got most of it, not all, but a lot of the North Korean army. They saved Seoul, and then they were in a position of, what do you do next? Do you go north, or do you just ratify South Korea at the DMZ zone? And they just chose to go north, and it worked until November.
We're going to continue with Victor Davis Hanson after the break. We have a lot of news breaking. The Supreme Court upholding Obamacare. But we're going to talk about lessons we need to learn from the so-called forgotten war, which is not forgotten on this show. We're going to talk Dean Acheson, Truman. Stay with us.
There are some who, for varying reasons, would appease Red China. They are blind to history's clear lesson. For history teaches with unmistakable emphasis that appeasement but begets new and bloodier war.
You are listening to the Laura Ingraham Show, marking the 65th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. We're joined by writer, thinker Victor Davis Hanson, who I think wrote one of the best books ever about the Korean War, and Matthew Ridgway. He continues with us. His book is on our Facebook page, and it's essential reading. When you hear MacArthur's words in his farewell address, Victor, has he, in a sense, been at least partially vindicated?
Well, his diagnosis of the Chinese threat was right on. It was 100% vindicated. The hesitation is that he's faulted for going all the way from the 38th parallel to the Yalu River without being physically present day by day in North Korea, and not understanding the enemy potential and the material and the manpower the Chinese could bring into the onslaught. And of course, he thought that with superior air power and nuclear weapons and a total war that the Chinese wouldn't intervene. He didn't realize that under the new rules of the Cold War, when two nuclear powers both have weapons, then you're going to have a conventional war, and neither side's going to use nuclear weapons. And that's something that he wasn't quite aware of. And so it was the longest military withdrawal in U.S. history, when we had to go from November all the way, to December. We withdrew about 350, 400 miles.
What about what some call Mao's involvement? I've read about Mao's manipulation of Korea into the conflict. What do we need to understand about?
I think we have to understand two things: that the war would have been over, and MacArthur was right, had the Chinese not intervened. They had warned us they were going to intervene if we got close to the Chinese border, but they put in a cumulative of about 850,000 troops. As you know, they went all the way down, and they took Seoul, South Korea, that was exchanged 4 times in March. Ridgway got there about the last day of 1950, and he had to withdraw Seoul and give it up, and then he took it back, but in 100 days. But one thing to remember is one of the reasons the Chinese never intervened in South Vietnam was they were deathly afraid of repeating the Korean experience. Everybody thinks Mao was this great military mind. He got over 1 million Chinese killed in U.S. air power, B-29s, and artillery, just absolutely devastated the Chinese from, about January of 1951 all the way till April. It's the worst military defeat the modern Chinese army ever suffered, and they didn't ever want to do this again. And that fact is completely lost about the Korean War.
And I know you don't have much more time, but I do want to touch on Averell Harriman. Of course, he's the son of Union Pacific Railway magnate and U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1943, and then worked on the Marshall Plan, national security advisor during the Korean War. He wanted out of there.
Yes. Well, the problem that MacArthur was facing is that he knew that a divided Korea would always be a thorn in everybody's side, and look what's happened. He said there's no substitute for victory, and here we are in 2015 with a lunatic North Korean government with nuclear weapons. So he was right about that. What he didn't understand is that the foreign policy, the so-called wise men in Washington 5 years after World War II, they didn't have a strategy to deal with the Soviet Union, and we got enormous pressure from, believe it or not, the Europeans, and they all said either one of two things. We're not going to support you because it's going to cause a nuclear war with Russia, and you're putting too many assets in Korea, and we can't protect Berlin and Germany. So they were coming all the way over the United States and begging us to get out of Korea or to, and they had voted to go in there, of course, with the United Nations resolution, but once they got there, the war was something they never anticipated. So we had almost no support from our allies, and the foreign policy establishment didn't want to be there. And
the internationalists didn't want to be there, right? The internationalists, the globalists didn't want to be there.
No, they did not want to be there. And Ridgway was sort of in between both sides. He said, you know what, I can go back up to I can win the war in North Korea in the way that MacArthur had originally envisioned, but I can't do it unless you're behind me. And that's going to be a big war. And if you're behind me, I'll go up there. But if you're not, I'm not going to go up there like we did before. And so he decided to stop about 30 miles north of the DMZ, and then the war was basically a trench warfare like World War I for the next 2 years.
In the Russian-Sino alliance, we see signs of that, of course, burgeoning again. But what led to that as the war began and developed? Well,
Russia didn't honor any of its World War II commitments to get out of Manchuria and to get out of Korea in the way that they should have. And so when Mao won the Chinese Revolution, Stalin thought this was a great chance to cause some trouble with the West. And then, as I said, they got the bomb in September 1949, and Mao and the North Koreans kept saying, we can take South Korea, and Stalin said, no, I'm afraid I don't want to do this. And then finally when he got the bomb, and he said, go ahead. So he greenlighted the invasion of June 1950, and he thought that it would be a very easy thing and that it wouldn't end up embarrassing North Korea or Chinese communists. And then when we stopped them and we went all the way to then he panicked and he sent about 40,000 Russians, and they were doing everything from anti-aircraft batteries to flying MiG-15s.
So back to Potsdam, the great deal at Potsdam. It worked out well on that side. Not right, of course not.
Well, I remember one thing about Stalin. He honored every agreement in World War II with the Axis powers. He signed a non-aggression pact with Germany and Hitler, and he honored it. He signed one with Japan, and he honored it. He signed one with Italy, and he honored it. And he broke every one with the people who helped him, the United States and Britain. And he literally gave fuel and materiel to the Nazis as they bombed London with a non-aggression pact. And then as soon as Hitler turned on him, he screamed and yelled and said, "You guys have to supply me." And we did, with 400,000 trucks, 2,000 locomotives, et cetera, et cetera. So we had a bad history with him. Nothing he ever told the United States turned out to be true, and he was the largest mass murderer until now in human history.
And just final question. We continue to allow North Korea to have nuclear weapons. We allowed that to occur. Why? We're so focused on the Middle East, and we're focused on Russia's and Kiev, and I'm talking about the foreign policy crowd. But North Korea, we tolerate that. We tolerate it all these years.
Because supposedly our allies, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, came to us and said, "We don't want a nuclear war. Don't force the issue, but we are under your nuclear umbrella." And now, of course, with this new administration, they're coming back to us and saying, "We either have to cut a deal with the Chinese, or you're going to have to re-guarantee that we're under your nuclear umbrella, because we're scared stiff not only of North Korea but the Chinese." And with the Obama administration, dissidents, they don't know. Our allies don't know what's going on. So I have a feeling that they're either going to make accommodations with China in hopes that they'll restrain North Korea, or they're going to go nuclear. And by the way, Japan could go nuclear in 6 months with 4,000, 5,000 weapons. So could Taiwan, so could the Philippines, so could South Korea. So we may see in our lifetime 4 or 5 nuclear powers in that area, because we were not able to restrain North Korea or to guarantee them autonomy from China.
That's the point I wanted to get to in this interview, because I think we're not going to do a lot to upset China, not when we probably have to come up with some debt servicing agreement.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The problem with the Obama administration is when they keep talking about eliminating nuclear weapons and dealing with the Iranians and sort of an appeasement policy, they encourage nuclear proliferation, whether from the Saudis or the Gulf kingdoms or from our allies in the Pacific, because those countries are not going to sit there and have nuclear weapons pointed down their throat if they don't think we're going to protect them strategically. And if we're not, they all have the ability and they will have the money and the desire to go nuclear.
Victor Davis Hanson, the author of a book that you must read this summer. If you for whatever reason didn't read this book before, the first time we had Victor Davis Hanson on, you must read The Savior Generals. How 5 great commanders saved wars that were lost from ancient Greece to Iraq. We adore you. You're so great. I just love you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Victor Davis Hanson here on the Laura Ingraham Show. Coming up, we're going to talk to John Bolton. A lot more to get to. Don't go away.
Why, my soldiers asked of me, surrender military advantages to an enemy in the field. I could not answer.
The Laura Ingraham Show.
The communist threat is a global one. Its successful advance in one sector threatens the destruction of every other sector. You cannot appease or otherwise surrender to communism in Asia without simultaneously undermining our efforts to halt its advance in Europe.
General Douglas MacArthur, his farewell address as we mark the 65th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. We just heard a fascinating account from, of course, Victor Davis Hanson. And joining us now, I'm thrilled he's with us, my friend, Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. We love watching him on Fox News. John, it's great to talk to you.
Glad to be with you.
And I know everyone's talking about the Obamacare ruling, but we can't do anything about that. But we can make sure that people learn from history. And I'd like just your general reflections on the Korean War and specifically this conversation we're having about how MacArthur may have been prescient in some areas. Obviously, he had his issues, but prescient regarding what the ultimate threat by the Chinese and a Chinese Sino-Russo alliance would mean for the world stability and our own security.
Well, I think he saw it much more clearly than did the U.S. political leadership in Washington. The war was really occasioned by a huge mistake from Dean Acheson when he gave a famous speech delineating the U.S. defense perimeter in the Western Pacific and left out South Korea. I mean, I have a lot of regard for Acheson and for Truman as well on national security issues, but this was a catastrophic mistake that I think helped induce both China and Russia to believe Kim Il-sung when he said, I can carry out this invasion and get away with it. So right from the beginning, we were in a terrible position and almost lost the war before MacArthur was able to carry out the landing at Incheon. And what he saw was if you're going to fight on the Korean Peninsula, the only objective can be finishing the reunification that the Russians had been blocking since the end of World War II. And again, because of the lack of will of political leadership in Washington, we didn't do what we needed to do to get intelligence about China and Russia, and MacArthur was surprised near the Yalu River. We suffered another catastrophic reverse and ended up in a gridlock basically where we started. So that, I think, helped set the pattern for the Cold War of missed opportunities and mistakes that's dogged us ever since.
And wasn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't Acheson, wasn't he along with Harriman, Averell Harriman, didn't they both end up being key to the whole Nixon-Mao summit? And I think they died around that same time. Didn't they work on that as well?
Well, they were certainly aware of it and thought it was the right thing to do. I mean, I think this is we have misread Chinese communist intentions for a long, long time, and a lot of people felt that ultimately the split between the Soviet Union and China was something we could use to our advantage, and I think we did to a certain extent. But unfortunately, in doing that and taking advantage of that split, we helped China advance. And if you think they've got our best interest in mind today, as I think many people in the left side of the political spectrum do, I think it's worth thinking about again.
John Foster Dulles, tell us about his role in all of this.
Well, I think he understood. He was very much involved in the Eisenhower administration as Secretary of State in negotiating the armistice that still persists from the time Eisenhower came into office. I think Eisenhower looked at what had happened and the muddle that had been made of the war after enormous American and South Korean sacrifice, and just decided to cut our losses. Eisenhower pledged to end the war in Korea, and that's what he did. But not because anybody was happy with the outcome. And I think that this acceptance of a stalemate, the fear of escalation, even when we had complete dominance in the nuclear weapons field, demonstrated a kind of unwillingness to take on the efforts by the communists to open up new fronts that eventually cost us so dearly in Vietnam and elsewhere.
And today, as I was just discussing with Victor Davis Hanson, we, I guess, are forced to tolerate North Korea. And it's in North Korea, the destabilization of the entire region. If we, if we decided to act against North Korea, but we've tolerated it year after year after year.
And we've done it in Republican and Democratic administrations alike, and it's been a mistake. And I'll tell you, we will find out at some point that North Korea and Iran have had extensive cooperation on their ballistic missile programs. We've known that since 1998. And I think on their nuclear weapons programs, too. People tend to stovepipe the threat of the North Korean nuclear weapons capability with and separate it from the Iranian nuclear weapons program. I think there are a lot of linkages. I'm sure a lot that we don't know about. But what it shows is the threat of proliferation is global, and trying to deal with North Korea as if it's an isolated case or Iran as if it's an isolated case has been a mistake these last 20 years.
John Bolton, it is so great to talk to you and get your perspective, which is a unique one, on this very important anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War, which officially never ended, right? There was never a peace treaty.
We still have an armistice, yeah. There's
right.
Still a UN flag at Panmunjom from the UN command, authorized in 1950.
Yeah, and North Korea wants reunification under communist rule. And
they still do.
They still do, and ultimately China would like that too. So we're going to see how that all plays out. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, John Bolton,
to do it.
Here on the Laura Ingraham Show.